the change in schedule today, being willing to do that. So we start this week with the third book of the Torah, the book of VaYikra, the book of Leviticus, and the prayer for Torah study, Baruch Atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So I want to, we're on page 584, actually, in the Eitz Chaim, because I want to go through this introduction to the book of Leviticus that is here from the Bible scholar Baruch Levine. So each one of the books of the Torah has a different Bible scholar in Eitz Chaim giving a one-page intro to the themes of the book. So each book of the Torah too is written quite differently, and it lends itself to different scholars becoming more proficient or more having more expertise about that subject than others. So the Bible scholars who are into laws of purity and laws of sacrifice would be interested in the book of Leviticus. So Baruch Levine is known for his work on this book. So I want to look at the intro that's on page 584. I also want to look at the intro below the line on 585. So that'll take up a lot of our time today, because I want to go through it, make sure we understand all the ins and outs of the book of Leviticus. So popularly called by the Hebrew name VaYikra, he called, which is its first word, right? So if you look at the English translation, it says the Lord called to Moses. There's a whole slew of commentary about the first verse, because literally it says VaYikra el Moshe, Vayidaber Adonai elav, me'ohel moed lemor. So if I were to translate this literally, he called to Moses, and God spoke to Moses, and God spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying. So the Hebrew grammatically is awkward because it starts with he, and any editor of any English writing would say, who's the he? And would mark it up in red. You can't start with a pronoun when people who are reading it don't know who the pronoun is referring to. Who's the he calling to Moses? And then it says God spoke to him. Well, who's the him? Well, the him is Moses, because Moses is right there in the phrase before. But who's the he? Who's doing the calling and who's doing the speaking? Is it the same person? So the English translation assumes it's God. So and then fixes all the problem in the Hebrew by translating the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him. Okay, so that makes it easier. It seems that that's what the verse is talking about, but it's really unclear. And it leads to commentaries that suggest perhaps an angel called to Moses, and then God spoke to Moses. And there is that commentary that suggests that with a comment saying, it's as if a king is calling a meeting with someone. The king wouldn't directly call that person to a meeting. The king would direct a courtier, go like, I don't know, based on my screen, go get Saul, because I want to have a meeting with him. So the courier would go to Saul and say, the king is requesting a meeting with you. Then Saul goes to the palace, and then the king speaks to Saul. So that's, according to one commentary, based on the rabbis, an understanding of how the first verse is going. So the English translation kind of covers over all of the problems in the Hebrew text by translating it this way. And we miss out on those problems by not having the literal translation in front of us. So, popularly called by the Hebrew name VaYikra, he called, which is its first word, Leviticus is known formally as Torah Kohanim, instructions for the priests, or like an instruction manual, the laws of the priests. From the Talmud, or from the Mishnah, actually, the tractate Megillah, chapter 1 of the Mishnah. So there we know from the very beginning, 1800, 1900 years ago, that the rabbis referred to the book of Leviticus as Torah Kohanim, because the bulk of the book is about what the priests are supposed to do. This title defines Leviticus as a prescription for the proper worship of the God of Israel. So in broad strokes, if we were to summarize what the book of Leviticus is about, it's about the laws, all the different rituals that the priests do. The Hebrew Bible reflects the central concerns of the ancient Israelites. Perhaps the most vital of these was to know how they were to express their loyalty to the Lord. This very question is posed by the prophet Micah, who answers it by emphasizing the primacy of justice and love, ultimately desired by God more than sacrifice. All right, so what Baruch Levine is doing is laying out for us that the Bible's intent as a book is to answer the spiritual needs of the people. Leviticus and the rest of the Torah now will answer that question by providing a worship service that will allow for the spiritual needs of the people. That, in other words, how do we find spirituality? By bringing an offering to God in the Mishkan. Or the prophets suggest, well, God doesn't want your sacrifice if it's not going to come with meaning behind it, like if it's not going to change your life. So what Micah says, do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. That's this reference to Micah here. So prophets, the books of the prophets suggest a different tact, not that in order to be spiritual, we need to transform ourselves into good people. So what is it? Is it sacrifices that will that define who we are as Jews, or is it proper moral and ethical behavior? So the Bible is unclear of what the answer is, because it provides both answers. Leviticus 19 gives a more specifically priestly answer to Micah's question. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord, your God, am holy. So another, Micah says, what does God want from you? Do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with the Lord. Here in Leviticus, it would be, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord, your God, am holy. So in chapter 19, the so-called holiness code provides us with behaviors that would reflect how we can be holy. How Israel was to live as a holy nation is the burden of Leviticus. Okay, so already in this paragraph, Baruch Levine is saying, yes, the book is known as Torah Kohanim, the law of the priests, but really what it's about is about holiness, seeking holiness. And we seek holiness through offerings that we bring, through the way the Kohanim offer them in the Mishkan, and in us being living holy lives. So the intro goes on. The contents of Leviticus are diverse, but unified by the theme of holiness. The first 7 chapters delineate the major types of sacrifices undertaken by Israelites and individually as a community. Right, so that's what we'll see in this week's portion and next week's portion, the whole series of sacrifices that could be offered. Chapters 8 to 10 record the emergence of sacred worship in ancient Israel by describing the initiation of the Aaronide priesthood and its first performance on the sanctuary altar, right? In other words, chapters 8 to 10 are the consecration ceremony of the priests. As a stern admonition, chapter 10 records an instance of improper officiating by two of Aaron's sons who meet their death at the hands of the Lord, right? So the consecration ceremony, and then Nadav and Avihu bring strange fire, and they're struck down by God, okay? That's really like the only narrative that happens in the book of Leviticus is that chapter. Everything else is laws, except for that chapter 10 being the only narrative, the only story that happens in the entire book. Leviticus 11 is one of two major sources in the Torah for kashrut, or the dietary laws, right? The list of animals, birds, and fish we can and can't eat. The subject of purity informs chapters 12 to 15, which specifies procedures for expiating impurity and susceptibility to danger, right? Things that would make us impure and how we go about becoming pure again. Continuing this theme, chapter 16 prescribes the rites of Yom Kippur, aimed at the periodic cleansing of the sanctuary and the Israelite people, right? 17 to 26 cohere as a literary unit referred to as the Holiness Code because of the frequent use of the term kadosh, right? So it goes from the sacrifices that are offered, the consecration ceremony of the priests, laws of kashrut and purity and Yom Kippur, to then the Holiness Code, 9 chapters of which are based on things that we should do. So like chapter 18, for example, is a whole list of sexual relations that are forbidden to us, other things that would be abominable, and then in a positive sense, all those things that we should do, like love your neighbor as you would be loved, as examples of behaviors we can do to be holy. This section begins by ordaining the place and form of proper worship of the God of Israel. It then defines the Israelite family and details improper sexual behavior, including incest. Perhaps the best known part of Leviticus is chapter 19, which resonates with the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, combining ritual and ethical teachings. It's here that we read, love your fellow as yourself. There is rabbinic commentary that actually lines up the 10 Commandments from chapter 20 of Exodus against chapter 19 of Leviticus, and like matching up those verses from Leviticus that match the 10 Commandments. So, for example, the 5th commandment is honor your father and mother, and in Leviticus 19, fear your mother and father. So so that's just one example of laws in Leviticus 19 that match up with the 10 Commandments. Chapters 20 to 22 contain more on the Israelite family and ordain specifically priestly duties and prerogatives. In chapter 23, the festivals and other holy days of the year are scheduled in a calendar of sacred time. The rest of the Holiness Code and its appendix add instructions to the priests about administration of the sanctuary and laws governing ownership of land and indebtedness. Here, the source for the inscription on the Liberty Bell proclaims the inalienable right of the Israelite people to its land. You shall proclaim release throughout the land for all its inhabitants. In an epilogue, the Israelites are admonished to obey God and forewarned of the consequences of disobedience, the most dire being exile from the land. 2 concepts embody the primary message of Leviticus. Okay, so now he goes from the first paragraph in which we're focusing on the laws of the Kohanim to now what these concepts are. First, the Israelites are one community called an Edah, united by a common destiny and by a holy way of life. as commanded by the Lord himself. They are forbidden to worship any other deity or allow the impure ways of other nations. Right. So one thing is that the land and the people are holy. Second, the Israelites were granted the promised land as an eternal estate on condition that they followed the laws of God and remain faithful to his covenant. In Leviticus, the priests of Israel are instructed in the ways of holiness, and the Israelites are told what the Lord requires of them. Okay, so the land and the people are holy, and the people have to maintain the holiness of the land of Israel by being holy themselves. What's interesting about this introduction is that that it doesn't include the idea that the author of the book of Leviticus is a different author from other books of the Torah. In the so-called documentary hypothesis, that is this theory that there are different strands of authorship in the Torah that were then redacted by a final editor. You have the E author. So simply put, anytime God is referred to as Elohim in the text, then the E author is at work. There's the J author. Anytime that God is referred to as Adonai, Yud He Vav He, then the J author is at work. You have the Deuteronomist, which is specifically for the book of Deuteronomy. And then you have the P author, the priestly author, which most of the book of Leviticus is the P author. There's some P authorship in other books of the Torah. For example, in the book of Numbers, the priestly blessing that we recite to our children every Friday night, but the Kohanim did recite every day in the temple. That is a remnant of priestly that's found in the book of Numbers. So you have different strands of authorship that make up this so-called documentary hypothesis that even some suggest there's an R strand as well, the redactor. So that part of the Torah that reflects the point of view of the editor who put all these different authors strands together. It would be fascinating. So you might have seen on the news yesterday that that Israel uncovered or revealed more Dead Sea Scrolls that were so there are all these caves along the Dead Sea that the Israel Antiquity Authority is slowly going through. It takes a lot of work, and it's dangerous work, kind of rappelling down from above to get to the cliff, and to make sure that that these caves hadn't been looted. What's fascinating from what I read yesterday, what they uncovered in this one cave is a completely intact basket, a huge basket, woven basket that is 10,000 years old. It's the oldest known full basket ever uncovered in the world. And that's just amazing that here is this product of human hands, this beautifully woven basket. Just look it up if you want to see pictures of it. Amazing. Look to the Times of Israel. That's where I read about it yesterday. Incredible picture of this basket. They also found tragically a skeleton of a boy that is 6,000 years old in a fetal position, wrapped in a blanket. So just incredible. And then these fragments of scrolls, both parchment and papyrus, Greek translation of two of the prophets in the Bible, Nahum and Zechariah, written in Greek except for God's name, which is written in Hebrew letters. So just fascinating stuff that will just provide more work to Bible scholars on and the language, comparing the language in those fragments to the so-called final edition that we have in the Bible today. So it would shed a lot of light on the development of the final text of the Bible. So we think that there are other Dead Sea Scrolls that have been found, that were found 50 years ago, of all books of the Bible except the book of Esther. Every single book of the Bible has been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they match up to our final edition, give and take a word here and there. So so we know that the Jewish Bible is at least 2,000 years old. So, which is fascinating in and of itself. Trope marks are different. I don't think there are any trope marks in cantillation marks in any of these Dead Sea Scrolls that were found. And there are no vowels in them too. So that those editions that have the like we're looking at a Chumash now that has vowels and cantillation marks, we don't have the final edition of that. That's only 1,200 years old when they were put in. But the words themselves and the format that they're in are, we know, at least 2,000 years old. So it's all fascinating stuff. Like I said, it could be challenging to some to suggest that there are different strands of authorship of different books of the Torah. So for me, it's not a challenge at all. It's a challenge to the traditional viewpoint that God gave the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai. Most modern Jews, most modern non-Orthodox Jews don't buy into the idea that God literally gave the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai. We do buy into the idea that the stories in the Torah go back to Mount Sinai, and that something happened at Mount Sinai to prompt people to then write down their experience into the form of the Torah that we have. So that's what I believe, and that these different editions were either edited in King David's time or possibly edited in Babylonia when the Jews were exiled to Babylonia after the destruction of the first temple. So both those ideas are around today in the biblical scholarship world. But we don't know a final proof of that. There's a lot of talk also recently about the book of Deuteronomy that might have been found, a scroll of the book of Deuteronomy. I forget where I read it last week or the week before. There's a book that was written by a journalist named Hanan Tigay called The Lost Book of the Torah, which describes this whole story of this bookseller and antiquities seller, a Jew who converted to Christianity, who moved to Jerusalem in the mid-1800s and supposedly found through his contacts where he bought his antiquities at the time, this scroll that totally had a different edition of the book of Deuteronomy in it. If you just Google that, you'll find what I'm talking about. And so all of these could be a challenge to the traditional notion of who wrote the Torah. For me, it doesn't matter. I know the Torah is at least 2,000 years old. It forms the basis for who we are as Jews today. And I see it as a sacred text. And it doesn't matter to me that there are different strands that lead, different oral traditions that would have been written at different periods in ancient Jewish history that lead to the text that we have today. Okay, so that's based on Baruch Levine's introduction here on 584. Now the bottom of below the line on 585. Leviticus is a difficult book for a modern person to read with reverence and appreciation. Right? I always say this to B'nai Mitzvah families who may be feeling unfortunate that their bar or bat mitzvah falls during the book of Leviticus. It's one thing to have the portion Emor, where it's mostly the Jewish holidays, right? And Paul's giving a thumbs up because that's his bar mitzvah portion. That's one thing to talk about the Jewish holidays. But if you were if you won the lottery and got Tazria Mitzora as a bar or bat mitzvah, which is about all the terrible things, disgusting things that will flow out of our body, or the skin rashes that we might have on our bodies, then it's a challenge as a bar or bat mitzvah student to come up to relate to that portion. What does this have to do with me today? Now, obviously with pandemic and how to deal with disease, okay. So in 2021, Tazri or Mitzara has some meaning, but otherwise it usually doesn't. And also this first portion and next week's portion, talking about bringing sacrifices, you really have to stretch to find out, to make some kind of connection, because we don't worship God in this way. We haven't worshiped God in this way for 2,000 years. What does this have to do with me as a Jew today and how I worship God? So it's a challenge. Its main subject matter, the commentary continues, animal offerings and ritual impurity, seems remote from contemporary concerns. Yet almost half of the 613 commandments of the Torah are found in this book, the text with which young children traditionally began their Jewish education, which is really, it is a tradition. I mean, we don't do it today, but we do. The ancient tradition, not ancient, the older tradition in the Cheder and in the Shtetl would be to start Hebrew instruction with the book of VaYikra, which is not the case. My kids went to the Charles E. Smith Day School. They began with Bereshit. So they really never got to VaYikra in the lower school at JDS. They went through Genesis and Exodus through 5th grade. So that's not the tradition today in community day schools. It might be the tradition in an Orthodox day school, but it's not at community day schools. When I went to day school myself, I also learned Bereshit and not VaYikra. Our concern in reading Leviticus should be more than historical. This is what our ancestors used to believe and practice. In other words, one way to approach it is we're connecting to our history when we read the book of VaYikra. Okay, that only gets you so far. I'd rather, some students might want to read something more relevant than some ancient text that went out of vogue 2,000 years ago. It should be an effort to understand the religious needs that were met by these practices in ancient times, needs that we still confront today, and the religious ideas that were taught in the process, right? So the challenge is to try to dig deeper below the surface to see this as a book that responds to our spiritual needs. How did ancient Israel see how to connect to Israel, to God? They did it in the way that was common 3,000 years ago, bringing a sacrifice to an altar that would be administered by some officiant. And so this makes, the book of Leviticus makes that process into an Israelite process. The modern temper tends to discount prescribed ritual in favor of spontaneous religious expression. That's a challenge too, right? So that, in other words, our spirituality is limited to how the Torah defines spirituality for us. In other words, according to the Torah, there isn't the opportunity to have spontaneous spiritual expression. If you have a spontaneous spiritual expression, well, then you got to get yourself a cow, goat, or sheep, or a handful of grain, and then get yourself to the altar and offer a peace offering, just because you're in the mood for it. So all that getting all that stuff together and making sure that you're in a purified state so that you can offer it, all of that might take away the spontaneity. Whereas, for today, people might want to, if they're at some gorgeous spot in nature that they've never been to before, they might want to respond to that in a spiritual way right there in the moment. And I always find this as a challenge also when I'm in an interfaith clergy gathering, where it's easy for my non-Jewish clergy colleagues, especially the Christian ones, who are able to come up with a prayer on the spot to kind of like start our meeting. And I'm not in the mindset to do that because I wasn't trained that way to compose a spontaneous prayer on the spot. But Christians are able to do that. They're trained to connect to that, to the emotions, to the spiritual emotions. So what the Torah is providing for us is the opposite of that. This is the anti-spontaneity religion. Yet something in the human soul responds to ritual, whether it be the formality of a traditional wedding, or the rituals of a sporting event, or a public meeting. There is something comforting about the familiar, the recognizable, the predictable. There is something deeply moving about performing a rite that is older than we are, one that goes back beyond the time of our parents and grandparents. At crucial times, it's important for us to know that we are doing it right. There is power in the knowledge that we are doing what generations of people before us have done in similar situations, something that other people in other places are doing at the same time and in the same way. So yeah, I hear what the commentary is telling us. You know, you certainly find this with rituals surrounding death. So, you know, no matter how tragic the death is, families are comforted by the rituals that take place at the cemetery, and that no matter how much they are grieving, no matter how sudden the death is, families participate by shoveling earth into the grave, by reciting the Kaddish, by ripping the ribbon or a garment. All these rituals, these ancient rituals, provide comfort in the moment. It's like it takes the chaos that is death and provides a path through it. So that's what I think this commentary is suggesting, that rituals help us make sense of the anarchy, the chaos, the mess that is the world around us. And rituals, including prescribed prayers, tell us what to do and say at times when we cannot rely on our own powers of inspiration to know what to do or say. Yeah, so the Torah, the book of Leviticus, doesn't talk about prayer at all, but prayer is the substitute for sacrifices. And there are prayers that we recite 3 times a day. The services that we recite 3 times a day take the place of sacrifice, and it's prescribed. There is room for us to say spontaneous prayer during these services, but we rely mostly on reciting the words. And even that is a comfort. Not just, it gives us something to do, a way to express our connection to God, but also, as it's saying, it's a way to connect, that we know there's comfort in knowing that other Jews are connecting in the same way around the world at the same time now, and that our ancestors connected to God in the same way too. So there is power in that ritual and in the ancient connection with the ritual too. Ritual is a way of giving voice to ultimate values. Each of us needs a sense of holiness to navigate the relentless secularity of our lives. And that's from Chancellor Ismar Shur. She was the chancellor of the seminary already now 2 chancellors ago. For the Israelites of biblical times, it must have been gratifying to know what to do when they wanted to approach God at crucial moments of their lives, in need or in gratitude. So now we get to the idea of, okay, well, that all could be well and good, and I can now understand the book of Leviticus in a 2021 set of eyes, but still, what do I do with sacrificing animals? Discomfort with sacrificing animals as a way of worship God is hardly a modern phenomenon. The biblical prophets criticized the sacrificial system for its tendency to deteriorate into form without feeling. That's what I had mentioned before, what Baruch Levine was getting at with the prophet Micah there. And Isaiah, like the Haftarah for Yom Kippur morning, is all about that. God doesn't want our fast on Yom Kippur, for we're going to end up still not being worried about the clothing the naked and feeding the hungry. So sacrifice is all about transforming our behavior. You don't just provide the sacrifice, you provide the sacrifice because you care about being committed to the covenant and doing the right thing all the time. So the biblical, the Midrash, now on to page 586, the Midrash envisions God saying, better that they bring their offerings to my table than that they bring them before idols. Okay, so there's the idea, better to bring the sacrifice than not do it at all, or no, or better to bring the sacrifice to God than to bring the sacrifice to idols. So yeah, let's make, yes, Jan, unmute yourself. Yeah.
So I know that we've talked many times before about how many times that the Jewish people wanted to do certain things that their neighboring peoples were doing.
Right.
So did the sacrifices come about because neighboring peoples were doing sacrifices? And so like if they're doing it, I want to do it too. But if I'm going to do it, at least kind of fashion it so that it kind of fits within Judaism as opposed to kind of drifting off to worshiping the idol of whoever.
Right. So I will say yes and no, because Bible scholars would say, what did people know at the time, 3,000 years ago, about worshiping God? They only knew sacrifices. The Israelites in Egypt saw what the Egyptians did. Other nations at the time, everybody was doing it that way. Nobody was going to shul or whatever form of shul there was. People weren't praying. They might have prayed, they might have said some words or sung some songs while they were offering sacrifices, but offering sacrifices was the way it was. So yes, what the Torah does is make it into Israelite practice, like give an Israelite flavor to the sacrifices that were common at the time. The other idea behind it is that Maimonides, who he's going to be quoting in a little bit here, Maimonides always tried to prove that that everything in the Torah makes sense, and that there's no other way when you logically explore the issue than to derive what the Torah teaches. And so, though Maimonides lived 800 years ago, long after sacrifices, so he was living 1,200 years after the temple was destroyed, he still saw the sacrificial system that the Torah taught as a rational system. It makes sense, it makes logical sense, and this is what Jews should be doing. And until the temple is rebuilt, prayer is just a substitute. So there are those who say that sacrifice makes sense, and that is a uniquely Jewish thing to do, and others who would say we're just copying what other people do and just giving it a Jewish bent. So there's no definitive answer to your question, Jim. So we're on the top left of 586 in the Eitz Chaim. I understand there's some people just coming in now, and I apologize for having had to change the time for class today. But we're looking at the intro to the book of Leviticus. We had done page 584, and now we're looking at the commentary that began below the line on 585. Now we're on 586, the top left. All religions of biblical time were based on sacrificial worship, and the Israelites could not conceive of religion without it. Basically what I just said to you. Maimonides believed that God did not savor this manner of worship, lest people assume that they were feeding God, who would go hungry without their gifts. Right? So there is that sense from what we read there. We're offering incense to God. Back in Exodus, we were reading about how the incense was supposed to be made, and the special incense vessels right? And this describes how sacrifices were offered with incense so that there would be a pleasing odor to the Lord. So what Maimonides has to point out is no, We don't believe in a God that actually smells and wants to savor smell. No, it's all about what we are doing as we're offering it. Bravanel, too, suggests that God never intended to call for animal offerings. After the Israelites worshiped the golden calf, however, God recognized the inability of people to deal with a totally abstract notion of the divine, and at that point ordained the details of the sacrificial system. Just as God does not need our prayers, although we need to pray, God does not need our sacrifices, although we need to offer them to feel God's nearness. So Bravanel, who was a commentator from the time of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain about 500 years ago or so, he's a rationalist like Maimonides, and says that sacrifices were a compromise, just like us being allowed to eat meat, eat animals. We were intended to be vegetarian, according to all the rabbis. And in fact, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, the first chief rabbi of Palestine, was a vegetarian. He said that, and it was only after Noah, after the flood, that God compromised and said, "Okay, I know that people are inherently evil and have this drive to kill. So let's channel that drive and allow human beings to kill animals for food. Perhaps that will allay any of their bloodthirst and just use it for that instead of killing other people and just being morally corrupt." So here too, God didn't want sacrifices anymore, but after the golden calf, God recognized that people just need this, and instead of worshiping idols, better to have a system that would be focused on God. So these are interesting ideas about how we can make sense of this sacrificial system. We're so near the end of that paragraph there on the left. We recognize this feeling in the eagerness of people to offer donations to charity to accompany their prayers or memorial observances. The cult that is organized worship through sacrifice is not a man's kindness to God, but God's kindness to man. That's, in other words, giving God's kindness to us, giving us a whole system to do in order to try to worship God. So God doesn't need it. Rather, God provides this system for us so that we can feel that we need God. Okay, so next paragraph. Although Leviticus outlines the technical procedures for the various offerings, the book of Psalms offers us insights into the spiritual, emotional dimension of the sacrificial system. In Psalms, it becomes clear how privileged the Israelite worshiper felt to be able to come into God's presence. "O God, deliver me by your name, by your power, vindicate me. Then I will offer you a free will sacrifice." That's from Psalm 54. Or, "O people, bless our God. I enter your house with burnt offerings. I pay my vows to you," from Psalm 66. And, "One thing I ask of the Lord, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. I sacrifice in his tent with shouts of joy." Right? So the book of Psalms adds the emotional component that how do we respond to the emotional and psychological feelings that we have in life, moments of joy and sadness. We respond by bringing sacrifices. And so the book of Psalms provides that an approach to these sacrifices that might make more sense to us today from an emotional, psychological perspective. Let's do one more paragraph. The destruction of the Second Temple and the abrupt end of the sacrificial system in the year 70 was traumatic for Jews, depriving them the accustomed way of reaching out to God. By that time, however, the synagogue had already evolved as a place for worshiping God through prayer and study. Piety, good deeds, and obedience to the covenant would take the place of animal offerings. Over the course of centuries, Jews learned to invest their prayer and religious deeds with the same feeling of nearness to God that the temple altar had evoked. Today, hardly any liberal Jew would choose a return to the sacrificial system, which is true. We have evolved so much and gotten used to, for the past 2,000 years, not being with the temple in Jerusalem, not having this system, that we can't imagine now going back to it. Even though the prayers that we recite every day talk about how we look forward to moving back to Israel in the time of the Messiah and God residing in the temple once again. And every Musaf service that we recite on Shabbat and holidays also reflects that idea that we want the sacrifices to come back. So that's why our conservative prayer book actually changes the words from "we look forward to doing this again" to "we remember how we did it." So the careful reader of the of Lev Shalem, the red prayer book, or the blue prayer book from before, and even the black prayer book from before that, will know that for the past 50 years in the conservative movement, we pray in the Musaf service how we remember instead of how we hope to. So the two words are asu v'hikrivu. They did and they sacrificed, as opposed to an Orthodox prayer book that will say na'aseh v'nakriv. We will do and we will sacrifice. So in an Orthodox or a traditional prayer book, in Musaf, we actually pray for wanting to sacrifice again. And the conservative prayer book, we pray that we remember. We can still pray for the temple, the building of the temple, because maybe the temple in the time of the Messiah, whenever the Messiah comes, will be prayer oriented and not sacrifice oriented. And it will unify the community of Israel. That we can pray for. But to actually pray to restore the sacrificial system, I actually feel that I personally don't pray for that. And the conservative movement feels the same way. The editors of our prayer books for the past 50 years have all agreed that we do not pray for that. So that's how much our system has evolved. And we could still read the book of Leviticus in this historical perspective and in this way that how the ancients tried to get closer to God. And that's a universal, timeless desire to get close to God. Okay. I need to end here for today because to get ready for my 11 o'clock meeting. I appreciate again being able to be flexible in your schedules. We will meet again next week, back to the normal time at 11 o'clock. We'll move on in the book of Leviticus to the portion Tzav next week. So have a good rest of the day and stay safe and healthy, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.